Do you think India has the capacity to be a superpower? Modi has positioned himself almost as the global south, the non-aligned leader, so to speak, between this, as you said, multipolarity of the US on one side and China on the other, although Trump's. Just curious for your thoughts on where India sits in this sort of power dynamic list.
It's clearly the most powerful country in its region, which is something that has prompted some challenges for India. One reason, you have a number of its smaller neighbors that resent what they feel to be Indian arrogance and bullying and so forth. And I'm not just talking about Pakistan, I'm talking about other countries in the region. But it is a regional power. I would argue that if we want to talk about India becoming a truly global power, I think that it would start with its economy. As you noted, it's now the fastest growing major economy in the world.
This is the Global Gambit.
How are you going, everybody? Welcome back to the Global Gambit, what is going to be a two-parter, focusing on India and Southern Asia more broadly. Firstly, looking at the, relationship with Trump's tariffs, and then the second part, looking more at, closer to home in the region between India, Pakistan, as Bangladesh, as there were quite a few rumblings there, which, given everything else that's going on, haven't been covered quite a lot. But I think from a geostrategic point of view, let alone geopolitical, it's quite worth considering. And, someone who knows a lot about all these matters is Michael Kugelman, Southern Asian expert and writer of the South Asia Brief for the Foreign Policy magazine, one of the most apt and I think, forward-thinking publications on international relations and foreign affairs, and certainly Michael's brief, which will be in the description. But Michael, focusing on part one of this, which I do want to be about the US-India relationship in the context of, it can only really be tariffs and, shall we say, economic/trade policy. We could talk about security policy further down the line a little bit and areas for room there. But right now, recording of April 10th, India has said it wants to move quickly on a trade deal with the US after Donald Trump has obviously decided to pause reciprocal tariffs on quite a few countries. What's your take there, and where do you think Delhi will be sitting on this vis-a-vis the US?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me back. Good to be back on the show with you. The U.S.-India relationship, I'd say, is in a pretty good place, generally speaking. President Trump clearly is someone who has affinity for India. He and Prime Minister Modi get along very well. They have a very strong bonhomie. And if you look at some of the top officials in the new Trump administration, a lot of champions of U.S.-India partnership, very robust champions of bilateral partnership. So I would argue that the tariff issue, or the trade issue more broadly, is one of the only sticking points in the relationship right now. But it's very interesting if you look at how India has approached this issue from the first days of the second Trump administration. It's quite striking. I would argue that New Delhi has gone out of its way to try to appease the Trump administration. It preemptively reduced a series of tariffs, including those that the president had repeatedly railed against, such as those focused on Harley Davidsons and things like that. India pledged to increase imports from the United States, and it said that it would be willing to take back undocumented Indians in the U.S., and it's already taken back some of them. So it had done a lot to, I think, try to reduce the risk that it would be hit hard by tariffs. Of course, as we know, at least initially, it was hit with 26% reciprocal tariffs. And this is, obvious. It's of course concerning for India, and just like its neighbors around the region, it's relieved that there is now a pause on those tariffs. But I want to argue that India has a lot going for it that its neighbors and many other countries don't have going for them. One is what you alluded to just before. There's a negotiation underway between the U.S. and India toward a bilateral trade agreement. And this is something that both leaders agreed to when Modi was in Washington during the early days of the second Trump administration. Modi was, I believe, just the fourth leader to meet Trump after he took power for the second time. And they agreed in Washington to begin negotiations on a deal that would be meant to reduce tariff and non-tariff trade barriers. So unlike many other countries that are, desperately trying to get the administration's attention and get it to agree to some type of arrangement or a deal that could result down the road in lower tariffs, India already has that. I mean, it had started before the reciprocal tariff policy was formally announced. So certainly, I think in New Delhi, they're nervous about what's happening, but I also think there's a level of confidence there that you don't have in a lot of world capitals, including other partners and allies of the United States. But I will say this before I go back to you: it'll be a very difficult negotiation. U.S. officials have said that everything is on the table in this negotiation, and that means that India is going to have to face a lot of different difficult decisions when it comes to reducing protections in some very politically significant areas like agriculture. If India were to start making large-scale changes to its farming sector and ease up on protections, that could have some notable political implications given how significant a constituency farmers are. Modi actually had to reverse some new agricultural liberalization laws that he introduced several years ago after he had massive farmer protests in India. And Modi is not one to reverse policies that often.
Stop the video, I hear you cry. He's biased? Well, how could I not be when this video is sponsored by CyberGhost VPN? Because in a world where governments, corporations, and even that dodgy cafe Wi-Fi are watching your every move, you'd be mad not to protect yourself, especially with something as effective as CyberGhost VPN. Now, why CyberGhost? Well, if you think incognito mode makes you invisible, cute. Your ISP, workplace, and even the sites you visit can still track everything you do online. That's where CyberGhost VPN steps in, encrypting your internet traffic and rerouting it through secure servers in 100+ countries. Meaning, well, no hackers, no prying eyes. Not even CyberGhost itself knows those dodgy dealings you'll inevitably be up to. Indeed, CyberGhost has over 38 million users, an excellent rate on Trustpilot, so it's definitely one of the next VPNs in the market. Unlocks everything. Hey, if you've ever tried watching something only to be hit with the quote, well, this content isn't available in your country, yeah, no thanks. CyberGhost lets you access 40+ streaming platforms from Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, from anywhere in the world. Just a few clicks and boom. Plenty more geopolitics, no more geo-restrictions. One subscription, but there's total coverage. It works on every device, laptop, phone, tablet, even your smart TV, and protects up to 7 devices at once. So you, your family, even the neighbour's dog, if you so wish to give them that access, are all covered. And get the deal before it's gone. Right now, CyberGhost is offering an insane 84% discount, plus 4 months free. That's practically daylight robbery in your favour. And with a 40-day money-back guarantee, it's completely risk-free. So, click the link in the description, grab CyberGhost VPN, and reclaim your online privacy before someone else does it for you.
Indeed. I've written down here that, you said Trump's a big fan of India, or the US generally they have. But how much is that the relationship personal to Modi himself, right? I think it wouldn't be too fair to point out that Trump certainly wants to deepen control over the presidency. His notion of trying to run again for a third term is obviously extremely disconcerting, I think. So how much is it that he likes Modi because Modi's done a better job of sort of centralizing or consolidating power, versus it is that he just likes India as a whole? Surely Trump has his reservations about India as a country, or those sorts of personal versus diplomatic relationships don't matter in this context.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that that one reason why Trump likes Modi and why they get along so well on both sides, not just from the Trump side, is indeed similar. How should I put this? Similar views of governance. If you get my drift, and also I think convergences on policies too when it comes to issues like immigration, Islamist terrorism, things like that. There's a lot of convergences there. But it is true that Trump has not held back from criticizing India. He has vociferously criticized India's tariff policies. He didn't say much about India on the campaign trail during his most recent campaign, but he did multiple times call out India's tariff policy. I mean, as you know, he's called India a tariff king. And so even, in one breath, while he'd praise Modi, he would also rail against these tariff policies. And he's also been critical of India, its air quality. That's something that he's brought a lot of attention to. But that said, I don't think that it goes further than that. I mean, if you look at the administration, as I said before, I mean, you have someone like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, or Mike Waltz at the NSC. Um, they want the relationship, the partnership with India to work. For them, it's not just about Trump and Modi. And I would say even for Trump, it's not just about the idea of ensuring that the U.S. is close with India because Modi is its leader. I think that even Trump would recognize that there are a number of compelling strategic and policy reasons to make sure that this partnership works. One of them, of course, being the China factor, and also the fact that the commercial partnership, despite the trade tensions, has grown between these two countries. And I'm sure Trump knows that India has invested quite heavily in the United States, I believe to the tune of about $40 billion worth of investments in recent years. And that includes creating several 100,000 jobs. India has also increased its imports of American goods by about $3 billion over the last few years. I'm sure he knows this, or those close to him know this. And that's clearly something he likes to see. And that's not just an issue of Modi. That's more an issue of India and its own policies and engagements with the U.S.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I'm curious also to hear is about the sort of relationship and how it's evolved since obviously Modi's less than, well, preferred for him and his base outcome last year. It was obviously a huge election year, and India was the largest of, well, any of them. And the government did see a setback in its overall size majority. How much do you think that has been playing into Modi's calculus for trying to deal with the Trump 2.0 presidency? Because a lot of people will claim that Modi is unstoppable. A lot of people that we've hosted on the channel before are very bullish on Modi. And whilst I think he's done a remarkable job in some ways, it hasn't been without its criticisms or shortcomings. So how do you think he has been thinking about this towards the Trump administration? And aside from what no one has fully expected, perhaps the rate and breadth of Trump's tariffs, but so he wants to get a deal on technology, but longer term, over the full term of Trump. What do you think he's got in mind?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, you're right that the BJP didn't do as well as many had expected in that election last year. But I think that it's bounced back in the sense that there's been a series of state elections in India since the national elections last year, and the BJP has triumphed. So I think that it feels quite confident about where it is. But there certainly are some vulnerabilities politically for the BJP. I mean, it is for the first time ruling in a coalition. Modi is ruling within a coalition for the first time. So that means he has to be careful. I mean, in terms of the fact that you have two regional parties that are his main coalition partners, and if he does something that they don't agree with, they can pull out, and if they do, that's it for the government. But my sense is that his relations with the regional his relations with the coalition partners are in a fairly good place. I would say that both of them are not ideologically aligned with the BJP at all. They're not fans of Hindu nationalism and Hindutva and so on. But the way these things work, so long as they're assured certain concessions, and that includes development financing and other budgetary support for the states where they are strong, these coalition partners, generally speaking, I think things will be okay. And on broader issues, economic issues, foreign policy issues, the coalition partners line up with Modi. But to your point about the Trump factor here, I would say that Modi is taking a risk in terms of how he has gone about dealing with this Trump administration. I said at the top that India has seemingly gone out of its way to appease the Trump administration, to try to reduce the risk of getting hit hard by tariffs. And so if that continues, right? I mean, if we see Modi, including in these negotiations with Trump on this, with the U.S. on this bilateral trade deal, if Modi and his government continue to agree to reduce tariffs and loosen protections, that could have political blowback. I mean, I mentioned before the issue with agriculture and farmers. I mean, many of them would not be happy if they lose certain protections that had benefited them over the years. Also, the issue of immigration, which is a very sensitive issue. If New Delhi continues to take back undocumented Indians from the United States, we know that when the first group of them came back to India, it emerged later that many of them were not treated well in the aircraft and so on. This is something that could have some political risk for Modi. Not significant levels of risk. I mean, as I had suggested before, he has recovered from that disappointing performance in last year's election. But, this is a government in India that likes to project itself as strong, confident, nationalistic. But if the Indian public perceives it as, essentially repeatedly making concessions to the Trump administration, which has been doing for quite some weeks, that could down the road have some type of impact, particularly in combination with other potential factors such as the economy. India's economy, generally speaking, is okay. Inflation has gone down, but you do have some weak spots. Some of the key sectors like manufacturing have not been as strong as many would like to see. So and the business sector, a series of industries could be doing better. So anyway, my point is that if the economy, if the public starts to feel some stress from the economy, and with all the tumult going on in the world now, there's always the chance that there could be some new shocks that prompt things to change in India economically. That then I think could pose some risks politically for Modi as well. But all that said, he's in a good place now. If he decides to run a fourth time, which he probably will in a few years, I mean, I'm confident saying that he'd probably be a favorite unless something significant changes over the next few years.
Interesting. I didn't know that there was a sort of an ability for the leader to run a fourth time. But I want to go back to something that you said about the concessions almost that the Modi government have been given to Trump. And I wrote down weird paradox here, because I think on the one hand, we have many people who are very proud of, well, sort of maybe not proud, they appreciate what Trump is trying to do, which is take more nationalist representation for America, right? There's a lot of people who support Modi who sort of look at Trump and are like, yes, we support Trump because he's trying to make America great again. And people sort of see that there's a lot of overlap there. But to your point, it seems to be that Modi is having to almost concede to certain demands by Washington, so that the greater game or sort of alignment or playing on the side of America vis-a-vis China, which we'll come to later on in the conversation, are kept. So can you break down this slight weird dynamic here where people support Trump, but at the same time they're noticing that their own leader is having to sort of, play political football with him to avoid, more disruptive dynamics there?
Yes, I think, first of all, you hit it on an important point that many members of Modi's base like Trump. They find him a very compelling leader. And I think perhaps that's several reasons for that. One, they see a lot of Modi in him. We talked before about how they have similar views of governance and leadership. Trump's views on issues like terrorism and things like that. Those are, I think, very much appeal to much of Modi's base. And also, Trump's having previously, his narrative about the U.S. deep state. I think that plays very well in India, where some members of Modi's base believe that the previous government in the United States was colluding with the deep state to destabilize India. And it was quite striking some months ago, the BJP, not the government, but the BJP, the ruling party, it issued statements indicating that the U.S. government was doing just that. So there's that whole deep state narrative thing, I think, plays well for many in India. But finally, and I think this is very important, and this gets to the issue of, they see their government making concession after concession to the U.S., and why are they okay with that? Well, they may not be okay with it over the longer term, but I think that it's something that could be accepted in the immediate term because of the fact that Trump, unlike Biden and the Biden administration, doesn't really care much, or doesn't care to comment or express concern about internal developments inside India. I mean, one reason why there was a lot of concern among many from Modi's base about the Biden administration was a view that it was meddlesome, that it was bringing too much attention to internal developments in India, like human rights and democracy. And President Trump and his administration, this is not an issue. They don't care about such a thing. So I think that in that sense, the many of those within the Indian public, particularly the members of Modi's base, they're willing to cut some slack to the Trump administration for having these very deep expectations of the Indian government, which the Indian government has been willing to meet by making all these concessions on trade, on immigration, and so on, and that's okay. But again, things could change down the road depending on how things play out with the economy and so on and so forth. But I think that the fact that the much of Modi's base perceives the Trump administration very differently than it perceives the Biden administration, because of this view that Trump is not going to meddle and not going to make comments or judgments about what's happening in India internally. That's very important for much of the Modi base.
Yeah, it is. And I know many of them will be watching. We've got quite a large community here. So I'm curious, you guys, what your opinion on this is. Are you, happy with the way that the Trump administration is treating India? Are you happy with Modi's response? Let me know in the comments. But Michael, one of the things that I often hear about these US-Indo dynamics is that a lot of Modi supporters, particularly, or those who are more of the sort of Hindu nationalist base, are very critical of the United States, or they see the US as a fledgling power on its way down. And they see there's some people who are really, really strong supporters who, envisage sort of a Bharat kind of future for the country and sub-region. Argue that, it's India's time, or India will be here, and the US is simply a means to an end for India. In the shorter term, is that something that sort of Modi's government really looks at, or is that him playing to the narrative of the political base, and India is still a little bit further off from being able to sort of be treated in the same great power status?
Yeah, well, I think that we have to distinguish between, when it comes to Indian perceptions of the United States, one needs to distinguish between perceptions of the foreign policy strategic elite and those of the broader public. I really think that when it comes to the former, the policymakers and the broader elite across the board support for the U.S. and partnership with the U.S. And this would apply to the political opposition in India as well. I mean, it's a very different time now in India than it was 10, 15 years ago, when you had leftist socialist parties that were in the governing coalitions in New Delhi, and they were very hostile to the idea of partnership with the U.S. But it's very different now. Those types of parties aren't playing much of a role, or aren't playing a role at all in the government, in the federal government, and they're not influential in that sense either. So across the board, on elite levels, support for the U.S. and growing trust, support for the idea of partnership. But indeed, if you look at the general public, and here I'm not going to, we have to be careful not to overgeneralize, right? We're talking about a country of more than 1 billion people.
Of course.
But I would say that among some of the more hardcore members of the Modi and BJP base, there does continue to be mistrust of the United States, particularly when compared to other countries that India has had a very deep relationship for much longer. And it's a very small number of countries that one could identify in that context. One would certainly be Russia, which is, has been, a constant partner for India. And it's when you hear Indian officials talk about Russia, they describe it as a relationship that's never had a crisis. And I think many members of the public would agree. And then if you look at a country like France, which is, quietly, we don't hear much about this. The India-France relationship is one of the deepest bilateral partnerships anywhere. And when I talk to Indian interlocutors, not in the policy world, but friends and acquaintances and others in the broader public, they'll say that, well, this is a country, it's a democracy, it's a close partner. It doesn't harass us about our internal situation. But when it comes to the U.S., there's still this view that it's troublesome, it's meddlesome, that it's up to no good. But I would argue that those views have lessened a bit since the new Trump administration came to power. As I said before, there is a perception that it's a more desirable partner. The U.S. is a more desirable partner with Trump in power because he's not going to be the guy, or it's not going to be that administration that tries to meddle in and render judgments about India's domestic situation. But that said, yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at how this administration in Washington has carried itself over its first few months in power, major changes from what we've seen earlier. But the question is, how might that impact India and Indian perceptions about that partnership? So, one thing that we're seeing from the Trump administration is a desire for the U.S. to have a much less deep global footprint in the world. It's pushing for more burden sharing with allies and partners and so on. That, I think, for Indians would not necessarily be seen as a bad thing, right? Indians on elite levels, but I think also many within the broader Indian public, they subscribe to this idea of multipolarity. They think it's important for there to be multiple poles of power, which would enable India to be more influential through its own partnerships with countries across the board in the West and elsewhere. It's the multilateral groups to which it's a part. And so if the U.S. is retreating from the world, or at least not playing as much of a role in the world, one could argue, I think, from an Indian perspective, that might enhance multipolarity, right? Because if you have, one of the world superpower not wanting to play that role of global superpower in ways that we've seen in the past, that might provide more space for what I would describe as middle powers. And I think that's a good way to describe India, for them to exert more agency and for them to do more on the global stage. It's a very fraught and indeed controversial debate about what type of power India is today. Some would argue that it's not that it's not a major power. Some would argue that it is, and that middle power is not enough of a term to describe India's
I would
clout.
be one of those. I'm quite surprised you say that, and we're getting more technical now as sort of terminology for people who might not be as familiar with international relations theories. But a middle power being a country that is more powerful than, say, Sierra Leone, but it's not quite the superpowers of, say, China or America. But to your point, Michael, how do we define what a superpower, middle power, or great power, hyperpower? How do we define any of these things? I personally think India is more powerful than many, but that sort of leads me to, maybe I'll reframe my thought as a question, which is, do you think that India has the capacity to be a superpower? Does it have already elements that it is? It's a demographic behemoth. The economy is growing rapidly, albeit very unequally, unfortunately. There is a lot of young talent that comes from India. I live here in London at the moment, and I'm constantly meeting on a daily basis, very successful up-and-coming Indian thought leaders and business professionals and so on. So do you think that India is sort of a great power in relative terms to others? And simply put, Modi has positioned himself almost as the global south, the non-aligned leader, so to speak, between this, as you said, multipolarity of the US on one side and China on the other, although Trump's, I think, even disintegrating that aspiration even more with the transatlantic relations in the toilet. So I don't know, quite a lot there to unpack, but just curious for your thoughts on where India sits in this sort of power dynamic list, if that makes sense.
No, I think that India is a growing power. It certainly is a regional power. That's one thing that I think is a safe assessment to make. It clearly is the most it's clearly the most powerful country in its region, which is something that has prompted some challenges for India. One reason, you have a number of its smaller neighbors that resent what they feel to be Indian arrogance and bullying and so forth. And I'm not just talking about Pakistan, I'm talking about other countries in the region. But it is a regional power. I would argue that if we want to talk about India becoming a truly global power, I think that it would start with its economy. As you noted, it's now the fastest growing major economy in the world, and I believe it's now the fourth largest economy on the whole. So it's making a lot of it certainly is making progress in that sense. And if you look at what it's been able to do to build itself out as a global tech power, I think that's critical. And story I like to tell, I had the good fortune for the first time ever to be at Davos this year. I'm not the type of person that would ordinarily be invited to Davos, but I was there this year, and walking down the main pavilion there, you have all of these American tech companies that are set up with their pavilions, showing their wares and so on. There were no tech companies from any other country in the world that were set up there except for Indian tech companies. It was basically like, you walk down the pavilion, every other building, it's an American tech company or it's an Indian tech company. And that was really striking. I think it shows how far India has come as a power. So there's that. But I think that it gets more complicated when you talk about where it stands more broadly. I do think a notable achievement that India has made that's really going to help it as it moves closer to becoming more of a global power is that it is now, and here comes another technical term which I'll define, it's a net security provider in ways it had not been before. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's for a long time it was one of the biggest arms importers in the world, but now it is starting to sell arms at a pretty significant rate. And this is something that the Trump administration and the Biden administration, for that matter, think is a very good thing. So BrahMos missiles, which ironically BrahMos is an initiative that entails Russian involvement and Indian involvement. Anyway, India has been selling BrahMos missiles, which are long-range supersonic missiles, to the Philippines. This has started happening, and clearly this is meant to be used by the Philippines to essentially strengthen its capacity to deter China in the South China Sea. India is also in talks with Indonesia, Vietnam, a few other countries here. Also, if you look at its naval power projection over as given everything happening in the Middle East, it's quite notable that you've had Indian naval ships in the Red Sea and other areas of other maritime areas of the Middle East, projecting power, helping rescue cargo ships that are targeted by Houthi missiles and by pirates, things like that. This really stands out in a big way. So, one of the big criticisms of India for many years is that it punches below its weight on the world stage. I mean, you have officials that boast about everything that India can do or could do on the global stage, but we're not seeing much concrete evidence of that. As it's become a net security provider, I think that India has a much stronger case that it is becoming a global power. But absolutely, there's still major challenges that stand in the way. The income inequalities at home, youth unemployment, things like that. These are troublesome. Not that countries without, incredibly robust economies cannot be major powers, but I think that it needs to work some of these issues out. And the final point I'll make, going back to what I said at the start, its neighborhood. It's got a lot of challenges in its neighborhood with Pakistan, with Bangladesh, which I believe we'll talk about. Some of the other countries in the region, a bit uncomfortable with what it's up to. China has really strengthened its presence in South Asia. I would argue that India's biggest foreign policy challenge is actually the one closest to home in its neighborhood. And I think it's difficult to become a global power and allocating all the resources that go with that if it's still stuck with these pretty significant diplomatic and geopolitical challenges closer to home.
Very well said. And that's certainly something we'll be looking into part 2. But it's the end of part 1, everyone. So,
and thanks again to CyberGhost for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check out the description link for Global Gambit users and make use of that special discount. This application will protect your data while you browse and give you full access to all block content on the internet for only $2 a month. Totally free, so do check it out.
Hit that like button, smash the subscribe, and be sure to ring the notification bell for when part 2 drops. See you then.